Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking with the design theorist, educator, and writer, Jessica Barness. Jessica is currently an associate professor in the School of Visual Communication Design at Kent State University and has published articles in design and culture, visual communication, dialectic, and visual language. Her current research centers around interactive environments and sound, critical practices, and design discourse and criticism. I was obviously very intrigued by that last one and was really excited to talk to her about that. But in addition to design criticism, we also talk about her own background and how she moved from being a practicing designer for many years to becoming a teacher and focusing on design theory. We talk about her teaching work and the types of classes that she's teaching, and we also talk about critical design. And Jessica does a really great job, I thought, of breaking down the differences between critical design, critical making, and design research, which I just found really helpful and fascinating, as those are all topics that come up on the podcast a lot, and to kind of really break those down and define those, I thought was really helpful. This is a fun one, and one that I think that you will enjoy quite a bit. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Jessica Barness. I know you primarily as kind of a design educator, a theorist, a writer, and so as I was researching you and thinking about this conversation, I realized that it seems like you had a kind of whole career before that as actually being a practicing designer.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to start with that a little bit. Where'd your interest in design come from, or how did you kind of get started as a designer?
So there's a story there.
Okay, great.
It goes back pretty far.
Perfect.
So as a kid, I was usually drawing or writing something. I just liked making books, and I made books all the time. So bookmaking is sort of my first introduction to that sort of designerly, illustration-based, message-making thing. Mm-hmm. And I think probably the first thing I made was, I think I was 7. I know this only because my mother wrote the date on one of these books that I made as a kid. And it was called If a Bloody Nose. It was 4 pages long. The craft was terrible. It was stapled together on like notebook paper, and there was red marker and blood like everywhere.
Yeah.
But it was this instruction book on what to do if you had a bloody nose. It must have been useful to someone. I'm sure maybe my brother had a bloody nose at the time, or someone did. But that's sort of my memories of, making things as a kid was stuff like that. In high school, though, my interest went more toward like math and science. And I was somehow my brain just liked those things. I really enjoyed even the visual aspects of those things. So visual formulas, visual diagrams, of thinking and visual things, they really tied together for me. And the art program at my high school was not very strong. So that making piece, that kind of designing stuff just wasn't coming out of me. And at some point in high school, at one of my art classes, we got a Macintosh computer. This was a while ago. Okay, as you can imagine, this was quite some time ago. And we had this program called Photoshop. And this was before Photoshop had layers or undo or anything. I mean, you really couldn't do much with it. But I started playing around with that, and I realized there was something about technology and image making that I just loved. And I ended up going into graphic design for like a bachelor's degree. So when I started college, I was in an art department with a graphic design emphasis at the University of Northern Iowa, which is in Cedar Falls, Iowa.
This is actually it's kind of funny to me because I was very similar as a kid. Yeah. I grew up from a very young age, just like you, making books. I drew maps a lot.
Oh, cool.
I would go kind of grocery shopping with my parents, and I remember asking them, like very young age, why the two on one sign looked different than the two on another sign.
Yeah.
And then I would like go home, as I got older and we got a computer, I would go home and try to recreate the signs from memory using it was a Microsoft Print Shop Deluxe, uh, and would try to like recreate these signs, but I never, like, that was my whole childhood, was just playing around with that stuff, but I never knew, similar to you, I think, that was a job or that graphic design was a thing until I got to high school and kind of all of these things came together and I realized that this could be a profession. What was that moment like for you, or where did you kind of find that this stuff that you were always interested in was called graphic design, or that you could be a graphic designer?
As a kid, and even like in high school, I really had no clue what that was. I wasn't aware of anything happening within the discipline or the profession. I had a couple of distant cousins that were, this kind of goes back another couple of decades actually, but they worked as like commercial artists,
oh, wow.
like graphic artists, and actually used that title. I did hand-done media, lots of illustration-based, wet media, things like that. And so I knew that you could be a person making these awesome visual things and you could do it for a living.
Mm-hmm.
So that was in my mind. However, I really couldn't draw very well. I still can't. Like that is not my forte. I just don't
same.
do that.
Me too.
I'm better with writing than drawing when it comes down to it. My sketches are terrible.
Okay, that makes me feel a lot better about myself, actually.
Oh, awful. I mean, I was better with, clay or watercolor or things like that, but just not like, I'm just not my students may be listening to this thinking, oh my, she's making us draw.
Yeah.
But then when I went on a college visit, again, I went to Northern Iowa, and I kind of knew I was interested in art or making things, and I also knew that I liked science. I liked technology and math a lot. Mm-hmm. And I ended up on a college visit with the Department of Art there, and my mother brought me to school to visit with a professor. And unknown to me at the time, the professor I was talking to was a contributing editor for Print Magazine.
Okay.
And that was Roy Barron's. Mm. And I remember sitting down with him in his office. I think I was a high school senior, and saying, I really like making things. I like also the very sort of math, objective parts to this. And I'm really not sure what that means. And he's like, well, you've come to the right place. And he's of explaining graphic design as being this way of making visual messages, but there's a kind of a concreteness to it as well. It's it's about expression, but it's also about the needs of the problem, or it's typographic. And suddenly all these words were coming out that I thought, okay, yeah, I'm going to try that. That sounds really cool. And I ended up doing that as an undergrad.
So when you were in school, then what was that? Did it all click for you? Did you kind of realize pretty quickly that, this actually is the thing that I've always been doing? This is the thing that I really like. Yeah,
definitely. And it, I think because I liked making books as a kid, I really gravitated toward publication design and typography. Illustration as well. But while I was taking those classes, I was also taking courses in painting, printmaking, paper making, because this was part of an art program. So we had classes in design and also in other areas. And it did click. I realized I also enjoyed writing quite a bit, and I also enjoyed learning about things outside of design. So I did a bachelor's degree. I didn't have a minor at the time, but I had taken enough classes outside of art and design to probably have a couple minors. Okay. And those things really sort of to feed what I was thinking about when I was designing something, other ways of looking at the world. I took a lot of classes in, this is crazy, like Russian literature.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For some reason.
Yeah.
I was really drawn to that. I took classes in anthropology.
Oh, interesting.
I took, what else? I think there were some other communication studies based courses in there as well. Lots of art history, lots of ancient art history.
Yeah.
So I kind of saw design as being a way that I could be creating things, creating these messages, but at the same time having these other interests
Right.
that I could design with that content.
And you were aware of that while you were in school? Because I feel like I'm definitely the same way. And the longer I've worked as a designer, I've realized that the thing I like about design, as much as I love typography and can talk about typography and grids for days, the thing that I really like is how it can be this way to understand things that aren't design. And I think I didn't know that when I was in school, even though all of my projects in undergrad were basically ways for me to kind of explore the other things I was interested in. I didn't realize that until years later. But you knew that. You kind of saw that connection right away.
I did. And I think it's because I was in an environment where I had to take courses outside of my major. And it was, it's a public university. So you had required courses outside of your major, of course.
Yeah.
But I think also because I had so many electives I could take, I thought, well, my gosh, there was a course I took on like archaeology in Indiana Jones, fake archaeology. I'm like, this is fantastic. So that's the kind of stuff that was holding my attention. And at the same time, I was studying publication design, typography, illustration. And about that time, some of the newer software coming out, and this was like back in the day where like Flash was a brand new thing.
Yeah.
So as soon as I discovered that, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to be doing. I want to be looking at how to make things move on screen and make them clickable. And at this point, there were such few web standards for designing websites that you could just start looking at the websites that design studios were coming out with. And, you were lucky, if your browser could open it, right? Because every browser, you had to have a different version of your website for each browser. But as soon as I kind of saw that, okay, I could learn this code or I could learn this software, I could learn how to animate something. It's like kind of like, sparks coming out of my brain. It was like, this is so cool. This is what I want to be doing. So I actually stayed at UNI for another couple of years to do an MA.
Right away, right after your
I just went right into it.
Okay.
Yeah, I realized that I wanted more time to explore this stuff. These things that were at the time, again, this was like the mid 90s. Sorry, like mid to late 90s.
Yeah.
Discovering this stuff that was at the time very new and very exciting. And I felt I wanted to get some more of that under my belt before looking for a job. I just wanted to have that experience. And because whenever a brand new technology comes out, there's not always a course that covers it. You kind of have to explore that on your own. So doing that MA, it was like a 4-semester program. It was heavily based on just studio time and theory classes and analysis classes. So it gave me an opportunity to just explore those things. And for my thesis exhibition, I did an environment that was like sound, video, interaction.
Oh, wow.
Printed stuff. It was so much fun. Like I would go into this, I had this little section of the gallery on campus, and I would just actually go into that space and just sit on the floor and just kind of soak it all up. I'm like, this is
amazing.
So exciting. And I like kind of missed that space.
Yeah.
It was small, but I'm like, this is all mine. I made this.
Yeah.
And after that happened, I kind of briefly, actually I spent about 8 weeks living on the West Coast just to sort of, I don't know. I had opportunity to sublet from some friends in the Bay Area. I thought, okay, I'll go do that. And I ended up moving back to the Midwest. And I moved to Chicago.
Okay.
Thinking, okay, I'm going to get my portfolio out in the world. It's going to be fantastic. And I had a few interviews lined up. And I had one design firm in particular wanted to interview me to do like experimental motion work. And I'm super excited about it. I'm all deliriously excited about this. And after about 2 days, kind of preparing for these interviews and doing things, 9/11 happened. And everything just kind of shut down.
Yeah.
And I know everyone kind of has a different story about what they were doing and where they were going at that time. But I was literally at home preparing for my interview.
Wow.
When the news was showing that. And come to find out, a lot of the firms that wanted to interview me, they were interested in my work, also had New York offices that were, of course, affected by this. And so everything just kind of stopped and got quiet. And I'm thinking, okay, no one knows what's going to happen. I'm living downtown Chicago, and the L's not running.
Right.
Government buildings are not operating. That was kind of this moment of, okay, what's going to happen? I didn't really know. So I actually started working in retail,
Okay.
and it just, I need to do something. And I
Yeah.
worked in retail, and that led to my boyfriend saw an ad in the paper. About 5 months later, he's like, you should totally like interview for this place. And it was for a company called Paper Source.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and ended up, long story short, working there for the better part of a decade as one of the product designers at corporate headquarters in Chicago. Total turn of events. I wasn't doing anything with motion or interaction or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
I was designing paper products and doing work with basically any paper production process you can imagine was something that I was on the team designing for.
Mm-hmm.
So letterpress engraving, die cutting, laser cutting, fabrication were, the company made its own paper and defined its own color palette, all of these things. At the same time, I was doing retail merchandising to some extent, service design, production, actually figuring out how to produce the stuff we were making. Because at the time, there were about 8 stores, and it was a privately owned company, and now they're well over 100, and they're public at this point. So it's the company grew really fast after a while.
Yeah.
So that was the practice-based career that I was coming out of.
Yeah.
And it
and so you were there. I'm sorry to cut you off. You were there for almost 10 years and then went back to school again. So
yes, I did.
Tell me about that. Like, why? What was going on? Why'd you want to do that?
That's what people were asking me at the time. They're like, "Why do you want to do that? What would you do this for? Why do you want to go back to school?" I think I reached a point with my career and my life where I decided that there was something I had yet to discover. I think about me and about the profession, and I wasn't necessarily interested in like graphic or communication design, or even design in general. I was looking at programs in urban design. I looked at library science. I was looking at like graphic design programs as well. So I was still thinking quite broadly, and I think that's part of the practice I was coming out of was very broad. I mean, I did some graphic design work while I was at Paper Source, but not. There was so much more like behind the scenes stuff that we did that it was like you could not think broadly about this. And this kind of coincided with about the time that my boss, who was the owner of the company, Sue Lindstrom, right about the time she sold the company, was around the time I sent out my MFA program applications.
Okay.
So it was like I could kind of sense a change in the way the company was going. But I was also, for me, and this is just my feeling on things, I was tired of making and designing things that were beautiful.
Yeah.
Or things that things that always looked just right. And I realize that's what people want, but for me, that's not what I was interested in making. And I think if you look at any of the current work I'm doing now, it's not really about aesthetics as much, but I wanted to do something else with it. I wanted to do more research. I wanted to figure out how design systems work in other ways. So that led me to an MFA program, and I ended up applying to the College of Design at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities.
Yep.
And started there in 2009.
This is a theme that comes up on the podcast a lot, and I don't know. It's something I think about a lot, and I wonder if it comes up on the podcast because I project my own story onto other people's stories. But this theme of designers working for a while and then kind of getting, whether it's getting bored, getting restless, this sense that like making things that look good isn't all there is, comes up again and again. And I definitely felt that. I mean, I worked for 6 years before I went back to school, and it was the same thing. It was like, is all I'm supposed to do is just kind of do this kind of decorating? Is it just to like make this stuff look good? Is that really all this is? And so I guess the question that I'm trying to get to, or what this is leading to, is did you have a sense that maybe, and I guess you did because you were looking at things like library science or urban planning, did you think that maybe graphic design wasn't the thing for you, or like, you know what I mean, or like why?
Yeah.
What was it about graphic design that you kept coming back to anyway?
That's a really great question. Yeah, I feel like it's sort of a boomerang sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, even before I did my bachelor's degree, I was looking at engineering
Oh, wow.
programs.
Yeah.
So it must just be me.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something about message making and communication that I think is something I always come back to, and the idea that I can be making something and studying something. I mean, I guess I also don't think of myself really as a graphic designer, maybe more designer broadly, or communication design. I really don't know. I don't think about the labels in that such a specific way.
Yeah.
But I do think that at this point in my life, and when I was deciding to pursue an MFA, it had sort of become part of my DNA.
Right.
It was just in the way that I think. And I think a lot of that had to do with the teachers I had in undergrad, for sure, and then the people I worked with, professionally before pursuing the MFA. And it also had to do with the program itself at the University of Minnesota. So the program I did, the MFA program, it's just MFA in design, and it includes areas of the program itself. The greater program includes it's graphic design, apparel design, retail merchandising, housing, apparel. I think I said that. So it was also a very broadly geared program.
That's interesting.
So I was studying design with other graduate students from these other areas, but my emphasis area was in graphic design and interaction design.
And what were you wanting to get out of that experience, or what was that kind of, what did you see yourself doing after that, or how did you see that, changing your career?
I went specifically to pursue, research and practice, and I knew that eventually I wanted to be working as faculty.
Okay. How'd that come in? Had you taught before? Like, why?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I want to apologize to the students that I taught the first time. Actually, after I finished my MA, this was back in 2001, I taught a May-term course at a small liberal arts college near Cedar Falls, and it was like a 3-week intro to communication design class. I'd never taught before. I don't think I was terrible at it. I thought, I don't ever want to teach again. This is horrible. I hate this. And, part of the problem was that I was literally a year older than some of my students. Right. It was just an awkward, weird time. And so I put that off for quite a long time. And I guess the pull to go back to school to do that, number one, had to do with, I knew I wanted to be doing some combination of research and practice, and that seemed like a great way to do that. That I could be teaching, educating, I could be doing creative work, and I could also be continually, maybe not continually, but always being able to dig into something else, right, and research something and bring that into my work. And honestly, I will give some credit to a friend of mine who's a printmaking professor at UNI, Aaron Wilson, who, I was talking to him this was in 2008, 2009, about a career change. And he's like, well, why don't you go back for your MFA and teach? Yeah. And it was just someone saying that to me. And I thought, oh, I could do that. Maybe that's what I'm going to do. Yeah. And things just kind of started to fall into place. So in my graduate program at the University of Minnesota, I taught a course every semester I was there. So by the time I was done with that program, I had taught 6 studio classes solo. Right. And so by doing that, you do learn whether or not you like to do it, number one, and you learn how to do it. And each semester gets better. But yeah, I had gone back because I knew I wanted to do something besides, or in addition to just practice. Yeah. Professional practice. And it was a way that I could dig into things. I could by going to a university of that size, I also knew that I could pursue sort of these tangential areas.
Right.
The program required so many credits outside of design, and I actually used that as a way to do a minor. They had graduate minors at school. So it all kind of just fell into place. I realized, okay, this is academia. These are things I can do while I'm here. And part of that also came from my thesis advisor, Stephen McCarthy, who I met before I actually even applied to the program, and kind of learned as we would talk and meet about whether it was a project we were working on together or in class or something, talking about how practice and research and teaching can all sort of be intertwined.
Yeah.
And that's...
Yeah, I love that you said that, because that literally sets up the next kind of series of questions that I had for you. And I kind of wanted to kind of pull back a little bit and talk about this in a little bit of a larger sense, because exactly what you just said is something that I kind of want to go a little deeper on, is this idea of kind of practice and research and teaching, and how those all fit together and kind of can be kind of separate things, but also can kind of be one thing. And I what I'm struck by in your background and in the way that you talk about all these things is this kind of fluidity of definitions, and that a designer can be more than just a decorator, I'm oversimplifying that, but that all of these things can kind of fit together under one thing. And that's something that's very interesting to me, and I think is why I went to grad school also, was because I had all of these separate interests, and they didn't feel like they were connecting for me. They felt like separate interests, and I really wanted them as one. And I'm curious how you think about that, both in your own work, but just, as in design in general, how these things can really kind of fit together and start to influence each other.
Yeah, they do all intertwine, and there is a fluidity to it. It's also very messy. Like, I don't think it's easy to put things into categories. Okay. Do we have time for another little backstory?
Yeah, of course.
It just influenced kind of how I think about things.
Yeah, go for it.
So my second year of grad school, I think it was like the fall semester, like 3 things kind of happened that I think actually inform the way I do all of this stuff now. I was taking a class that Stephen McCarthy taught called the Design Studio, which is all about it's like research and practice brought together under this the theories of design authorship. So you're making and creating your own work. At the same time, I was taking a course in a writing studies program on mashups and pop culture, and it was taught by a rhetoric professor. Okay. So at the same time, I'm getting all the critical theory and pop culture stuff, and we're deconstructing videos and music and all these things. Also, at the same time, I was working as a designer with an architecture firm in Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yeah. That actually it was owned by architecture faculty that were also practicing. So I actually saw, as I was, on a daily basis, I could see practice and research informing each other in the profession. So they're very, very messy things. And when my students ask me, how do I separate these things? How do I, and this is getting into like just separation of process when they're working on a project. Yeah. I say, well, you can't. It's messy, and it's okay. You have to accept the messiness, because all of these things will constantly intertwine. Yeah. In my own work, I do predominantly writing currently, but I've worked in sound. I work in visuals. I work in motion, interaction. And to me, it's all about message making, whatever form that might take. So not being tied to a single mode or a single type of media, to me has been really helpful, because it's allowed me to explore kind of any topic I want to be exploring. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing I bring into my classroom, is this idea that you're not dealing with just visual or just written, that you can do, audio-based stuff, for example.
This is a question that I've been asking every teacher that I've talked to recently, as my practice teaching has become a bigger and bigger part of my practice over the last couple of years. And I realized a couple of months ago, about a year ago or so, that the classroom is the place where all of these things really come together in a very clear way, where it is design, like visual design and making, it is writing, it is research, it is criticism, it is theory. Like all of the things that I like about design really overlap and come together in the clearest way inside the classroom. And I'm curious about kind of, because I feel like you're similar in that you kind of have these really wide interests. What's that classroom like? Do those really start to overlap for you there like that?
They do. They do. They definitely do. Depending on the class. I mean, depending on what I'm teaching, some of them may be more focused on one specific kind of design. Like, for example, I teach motion design, which is much more focused on like animation, kinetics, things like that. The upper level classes I teach and the graduate courses I teach, they do get much messier in terms of, how do you balance the research and the practice? I think it's difficult for students to understand that it isn't always this clear-cut thing.
Right. Yeah.
That it's not always like, oh, I do my research in this category and then I make something. They go back and forth and back and forth, and some students really understand that well, and some really struggle with it. There's also understanding to what depth you should be researching something.
Right.
Is it, on one hand, there's visual research, or the gathering color palettes, inspirational images, textures, patterns, things that you like. There's also the research that gets into interviewing other humans or conducting surveys, or just going out into the world and watching people behave in certain environments. And those are all different kinds of research that designers do, and they all have different outcomes, and no two projects are the same. There's a course I teach in our graduate program that's it's actually a summer course. I'm going to be teaching it next week.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, this is very timely. Where it's called Critical Practices in Design Research, and there are readings and discussions interspersed with the act of making as a way to understand those things. And it's a course that's set up so that you're writing while you're also making something, and you're referencing critical theory or literature outside of our discipline to inform your work. And I think it really challenges students to think about what they're making and why, and to be able to write it. And a lot of my students dislike writing. I don't know why. It seems to be a thing, so it takes practice to write and to be comfortable writing. And again, it's just, short form drafts, some short essays, and just over drafts and discussion and rebuilding. Eventually the making and the writing start to kind of come together, and they kind of feed off one another.
I have two questions. I'm going to give them both. I'm going to set both of them up now, and then we can kind of parse them out however you want. Because I want to talk a little bit about this idea of critical practices, and I also want to talk a little bit about writing. So let's start with the critical practices one, because you started talking about that first. Because I noticed that in a couple of places when I was preparing for this, that you're very interested in critical practices within graphic design. And I would love, I don't know if I have a question other than that I would love for you to kind of talk about what that means and what that looks like. Again, it's a topic that comes up on the podcast often. And I think especially in my experience in talking with students about kind of critical design, especially, it often devolves into a style again, and as like critical design or something is design that looks a certain way. And I would love for you to just kind of like parse that out a little bit, or kind of talk about what that means for you, or how the language you put around that.
Sure. So a few years ago, I met one of my current collaborators, Amy Papelius, at a very small modern languages conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We met in a dimly lit hallway. And we started talking about critical making was one of the things we started talking about. And that kind of led to this editorial project. We guest edited an issue of Visible Language Journal around that topic of critical making with design and digital humanities, because we saw that graphic design and the humanities had so many overlaps, especially when you're looking at writing and text typography, data visualizations, prototyping in general. There were all these crossovers. And so that project was informing my research, my personal scholarly research, in that I could be creating these works that investigated theories or phenomena or technologies. And it was critical in that I was interrogating something through the making process, and I was writing at the same time.
Right.
I was also coming out of an MFA program where design authorship and critical design were things that were always discussed and always kind of being practiced. And so fast forward recently, my longtime collaborator, Stephen McCarthy, and I did a presentation at a design incubation colloquium here at Kent State, and we titled it Critical Practices as a Form of Design Scholarship. And in that, we sort of set this up that critical practices is sort of like a group of things, right? So you have design authorship, critical making, and critical design. So even by breaking it up into three parts, you start to kind of move away from it stylistic thing, and they're just ways of thinking, ways of working. Each one's a little bit different, but I don't think I don't speak for myself here, but you can't separate one from the other. They all sort of feed into one another. But, one is about initiating and being entrepreneurial. That's probably design authorship. You're taking the lead on these projects. Critical making is, the way I define it, the way I explain this to my students, is undertaking a project in order to understand something else better or to interrogate something. And it can be a phenomenon you observe. It can be a theory you want to better understand. It could be a technology. And a lot of it's technologically focused. If you go into other scholars working in critical making, it often is technologically focused in some way. And critical design, as you mentioned, is, I think of it in terms of, Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. It's futuristic, and there is this aesthetic associated with it, but it doesn't need to be associated with it.
Right.
It can, stylistically, any of these areas of critical practice can be anything. They don't have to be beautiful. They don't have to be futuristic. It's making as part of being a critically thinking designer.
I love that. I really like the way that you broke that down, actually. I think that makes a lot of sense to kind of separate them out into those subcategories, but then, with the realization that they all are influencing each other.
Oh, yeah. They definitely intertwine. I don't think you can completely take one out of the group and leave the other two feeling okay. They all sort of mix and match. And in the class I teach, this is how I present it to the students. And these are mostly MFA students, possibly some undergrads too. And we look at these things and think about them and discuss not so much, which category do you belong to, but sort of how does a certain project, what's the approach you want to take and what do you want to get out of it?
I guess this is mostly grad students, but you said there are undergraduate students. How do the undergraduate students kind of take to this? And the reason I ask that is that I've found, I teach both graduate and undergraduate students also, and the graduate students are much more interested and open to this idea. And this is a broad generalization. I don't mean this as everyone, but I sometimes sense a little more resistance with undergraduate students in thinking about this, because a lot of them just want to make stuff that looks cool. You know what I mean?
Totally. Definitely. And that's kind of been my experience as well. Although it's I guess it brings up a diversity of thought in a way. I think there are designers and design students who are focused on style, and there are other students and designers who are are interested in digging deeper and are more interested in design research. And here in our program at Kent State, design research is part of almost every single course we teach. We have undergraduate courses in design research. We have MA courses and MFA courses. So in some ways, the students are early in their programs, they're exposed to research methods for design. So that kind of immediately takes them out of thinking about style and making it look awesome and all these things. And instead kind of thinking about, okay, what's underneath that?
Right.
How do you know what you know when you're designing something? And I think in terms of this critical practices class, the MFA students and MA students tend to be more prepared for it, just in that they've decided to go to graduate school.
Right.
You know, you're going to be exposed to all these different things. The undergraduates have, it's a little more of a leap. I think that it forces them to get out of their comfort zone with, I can make this look amazing. And if it can communicate what I want, then it's perfect. And it's actually, I think, letting them also know it's okay to not be thinking about your portfolio for every single project, because it's a huge stress. I talk to my undergraduates in particular because they want to finish their undergraduate degree, and they're going to have a portfolio, and they're going to go out in the job market. And so that is like the first thing on their minds. So I think you have to kind of create a classroom environment where they're allowed to experiment and it's okay. And then with those experiments, you can kind of also help guide them toward later on figuring out how that sits in a portfolio and what's the context for it.
I love that.
In showing that it's not everything has to be this perfect, finished, polished thing, but it's okay to show how you're thinking and the research going into it, and just sort of how you know what you know.
I want to come back to writing a little bit, because you've mentioned that a couple times. It was part of your MFA. You talked about how students sometimes are resistant to it. I also have a deep interest in writing. I spend a lot of my time writing lately. I'm very fascinated by the kind of intersections or the relationships between design and writing, and how those practices can be similar and how they're different. And I'm curious what your experience with that is like, both, in your own writing, but then also kind of when you're talking about it with students.
So I wasn't always comfortable with writing. This is kind of a new-ish thing. Okay. Fairly recent. Well, recently in comparison, I guess. So when I was a practicing professional designer, I really didn't do a whole lot of writing, like long form writing of any kind. I was always reading, of course, and on occasion I might write like marketing copy, or proposal copy, or things like that. So when I got into graduate school, I realized, okay, I'm going to have to figure this out. I need to be able to write. And so I could mention I did a minor in writing studies and rhetoric, which kicked my butt the first semester. I was in classes with students who were getting their PhDs in writing studies, or they've been writing throughout their entire college careers, and I felt like, I'm failing at this. I don't know how to do this. And my professor, I had a talk with him after class one day, and I said, I'm really struggling with this. I know there's a connection between, mashups and pop culture and design and writing. I can't figure out what this is. And this is Professor John Logie at Minnesota, and he looked at me. He said, "My wife is a graphic designer, so I kind of get it." I'm like, oh, it was great, because I think he kind of understood, in some ways, maybe not entirely, but that I was struggling with this. And so for that whole entire semester, I was learning how to write an argument. Learning how to persuasively argue a point and provide evidence for it. And this was done like on a weekly basis. It was like drilling this into my head. So by the time I left graduate school, writing was easier. It was a lot easier, and I really liked doing it. As faculty, I've struggled with it a little bit, because there's, for me, kind of a battle sometimes between publishing written work and exhibiting or presenting creative work.
Right.
And I wasn't always sure how those things came together. And there was one point where I was writing more than I was making stuff. And it was this strange feeling like I'm neglecting that designing part of my brain.
Yeah.
And it wasn't being true to myself. And it was just this kind of internal conflict. And I was expressing this to my mentor from undergraduate school, Roy Barron's, and I said, how have you done this your whole career? He's published prolifically. And I wonder, how do you separate the two things? And he just said it so simply. And this has stuck with me. And I tell my students this: we're designing with words.
Yeah.
And thinking about that, I'm like, yeah, that's right. I'm designing with words.
Yeah.
Suddenly it became easier. And so when my students are writing things, that's kind of how I present this. It's, writing can be a collage. You're cutting and pasting, you're putting in new material, you're borrowing. Citing, not borrowing, citing and referencing appropriately. But that it doesn't have to be this a blank page. You can take little notes and then stitch those notes together into bigger ideas. There are frameworks you can use to kind of structure your arguments. And I say the word argument, and the students look at me like, we're not arguing. Why should we be arguing? No, that's not what I'm talking about. But I think you have to relate writing and design in a way that makes sense. And for me, that's the sort of cut and paste, little by little drafts, lots of drafts. Nothing is perfect the first time. But that's sort of how I tie the two together.
This is something that I've never thought of until you were talking about this right now. So I don't know if I'm going to agree with what I'm about to say, but I kind of just want to put it out there and just see if it works. Everything you're talking about, it feels very similar to my own experience, especially when I first started grad school, and so much of my work was writing based, and I just like wanted to make stuff again because I felt like so much of the stuff I was doing was writing. And I realized that I often thought of writing as just kind of, making an argument, or just, getting an idea out into words. Mm-hmm. And the thing that made writing more interesting, and I always loved writing, but made it more interesting, made it connect to my design work, is actually the thing that I was feeling frustrated with in design. And it was that kind of visual layer. It was the form making part. And it's actually the style, the rhythm, the form of writing that was this kind of revelation to me of, oh, this is a type of design also. And I've spent all my time thinking about the idea and what I'm trying to say, but not actually how I want to say it. And so it was like that thing with design that I almost felt like was easy and boring was actually the hard part in writing.
Yeah, it is. And, definitely when you talk about style and writing, that's, and that's something that maybe I take for granted in design, is that, okay, I kind of know what maybe my style is visually,
right? But
my writing style, I don't know. It depends on what I'm writing.
Yeah.
I also found it helpful with sort of, the thing that I was studying in my writing studies and rhetoric classes was the sort of the expansion of the concept of writing as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can write with sound, right? You can write with visuals. You can write with media, generally speaking, is so malleable in a way that you can create messages all these different ways. The idea of writing with sound is something, I guess, maybe that we're doing that now. Maybe we're writing now. But the idea that it's not as concrete, or as there's a lot of freedom in it with the form that it takes. Mm-hmm. Like my students that have trouble writing, oftentimes what I'll ask them to do is to dictate their thoughts. For example, like in Google Docs, you can like voice record and Docs will type for you. And that's a way for them to kind of get ideas out of their head and then go in like it's a collage and start cutting, pasting, filling in the gaps. And everyone writes differently. It's difficult, I think, to teach one way to write something. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you think of it as the expansion of writing, whether it's spatial, sound-based, visual, or it's, Microsoft Word,
Right. Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
you decide to use. There are different ways to get those ideas out of your head and onto a paper or a screen or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. That's great. I have a couple kind of just quick questions. These are questions that I ask everybody to kind of wrap up the conversation, but I'm going to ask you one other question before I get to those, because this question will set those questions up. Because on your website, you have listed under current research something to the effect of design discourse and criticism in the public sphere or something like that.
Yeah.
Design discourse. I just pulled your website up. Design discourse and criticism in the public sphere, which is very related to the questions that this podcast is trying to ask, I think. And so I kind of want to set up these final questions with you talking about what that research is like for you, or what your interest around that is.
Yeah. So that's actually my current work. It's very current within the past few years. So what I've noticed with my students, this is where it started. I noticed my students would be looking at like design websites, design blogs, and they'd be reading articles on them, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, that's great, that's so cool." They'd love what they were reading or what they were looking at, and then they would, share it or tweet it. Then they'd kind of like shut the screen. And I'm looking at them like, what are you doing? Like, what? And I'm trying to make sense of this. And I realized that this is kind of going back into like, early 2000s and the 90s. This idea of commentary online is it's fading. It's fading quickly. And the more I started looking into this, I was looking at it in terms of like related literature. Again, I'm doing my lit review. And then I'm also looking at like existing examples of this. And so I started looking at blogs. I started using the Internet Archive to look back on things and studying kind of where these conversations are happening. I mean, if you look back a few decades now, which is wacky, magazines like Emigre, right, had letters to the editor.
Yeah.
That was the space that you could write to Emigre, and you could voice your opinion on something, and possibly in the next issue there might be a response back. There might be that dialogue that happens, and eventually that gave way to design blogs, right? So I'm thinking of like Speak Up, Design Observer, and these were things I was looking at, as a practicing designer too. And the blog commentary was like, it was crazy. It was all over the place. And there were these great like bits of wisdom or insight, or there was ranting, there was rudeness, there was like everything was in there. And then it just kind of died. I feel like it just sort of like stopped.
Yeah.
And so I set up this study where I looked at, actually I had kind of figured out, okay, these are sort of the models or the platforms where this like online discourse was happening. And I chose to look at Design Observer, Speak Up, and iMagazine's blog. And I won't go into the nitty gritty details of it, but I essentially extracted like 6 weeks worth of blog posts for each of those blogs for each year over the lifetime of their existence. And what I found was, kind of what I expected, but it was really strange to see it. Like actually infographic this out. There was, this peak of online commentary and discourse and conversation. And then it all 3 platforms, it just kind of dropped. And granted, Speak Up, ended its time. Design Observer is still going and iMagazine is still going. But the thing that they all had in common was that once other social media platforms ramped up, that stuff went down.
Yeah, that's where I thought this was going.
It's weird. And if you look at some of the comments on those websites, sort of in the era of Twitter, the comments even change.
Yep.
They start to become things like, "Great job, really enjoyed it."
Yeah.
And that's great for the person who wrote the article, but it doesn't put anything out there as far as conversation. And even if you trace some of those links being shared on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and I'm looking only at public forums. Even those things they're being shared and they're being liked, but we're not always discussing them. Mm-hmm. And I think, going back to the students that I saw looking at this stuff and then it's kind of like, from my perception, kind of dismissing it. I'm like, but you could argue those points. You could argue what that article is telling you. You could agree with it. You could add something to it. And I suppose this gets kind of into, instruction of writing in design. But, on one hand, I'm kind of looking at it like, well, where are those discussions happening? Are they happening? We're having one.
Yeah.
If this was a call-in show,
right.
I'd be like, hey, guys, ask us more questions. And I'm wondering if, these smaller conversations are probably happening in private circles. Mm-hmm. Slack, I know they're happening there. They're happening in private email threads. But at the same time, I kind of ask broadly, this is kind of one of my research questions, like what's happening to our public critical discourse and conversations. And this kind of gets into my own concerns with like archiving and preservation and how do we find this information in the future. Yeah. You can go on Internet Archive and look at tons of stuff and it's all sitting there. Mm-hmm. Whether or not it's existing currently on a website today, but you can go back and you can see, who said what and who's referring to what and what was the big topic of that day or that month. There are some platforms where you can kind of see a spike when there were big international events. Just in those conversations surrounding it. And so one of the questions I'm kind of asking as I'm researching this is, where are those conversations happening? Is it okay that they're not? One media platform perhaps kills the one that came before it. Right. We just keep on progressing into something different. And I don't want to say what's good or what's bad. I can judge it personally, but I don't want to judge it professionally. I can't say this is a bad thing. But I do wonder where we're going with it, and if it's going to be okay, if it's would it hurt us, to not have that kind of commentary, or is it going to take another form we just haven't really figured out what that is yet?
I'm so mad. I'm so mad. I waited till the end to ask you this because I could talk about this for so long, because this is all the things I think about, and really was kind of the origins of this podcast in a lot of ways. It started as my MFA thesis project because I felt like there was some sort of lack of design criticism or lack of design discourse. And what I quickly realized, I've talked about this with other people on the podcast before, is that it wasn't that there was necessarily a lack or that people weren't interested in talking about it, but that it had all moved to Twitter and had all moved to 140 character critiques. And that I kind of discovered design in the early 2000s because of Speak Up and Design Observer, and so I have a fondness for the blog format and the comment format, and that just really doesn't exist anymore, and that this podcast is some sort of kind of meager attempt to have some sort of long form discussion or something that goes a little bit deeper than that. And so everything you're saying is stuff that completely I'm like, I mean, we could just go on and on about that because I think you're doing really interesting work. I think what you're talking about is exactly right.
I think this podcast is fantastic, by the way. I mean, I've looked at. I did not say that to set it up for a compliment. It's okay. It's but really, as I'm looking at this stuff, I have been looking at podcasts as well, because these are like, in a sense, living conversations, right? They're going to be archived. They're available to the public. This is adding to the discourse. And so, maybe this is, maybe it's not Twitter, maybe it's podcasts, but I don't know. Yeah. It is frustrating though, to be looking at these blogs and podcasts to me are sort of set up a little bit like blogs in that you're archiving things by episode or by date. And you've got, potentially keywords or notes attached to them. So you can kind of go back in to an archive, whether it's on Design Observer or whether it's, scratching the surface, and you can see who said what and when and what they talked about. when you get into something like Twitter, which really, I mean, it's actually opened up a lot of possibilities as well,
Yeah.
because you can literally converse with anybody. But there is a sort of a memory based task involved with, like,
Right.
following a hashtag, or
Right.
remembering who said what, or, archiving tweets, or digging things up in a very different kind of way. I think there's something about that scale of information that can make it more difficult.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a path that we continue on. And I say we because it's kind of everybody.
Right.
It's not even just design. But I think about it in terms of design because of, I think, the importance of design criticism and design conversations. And this kind of gets into like a little bit of Foucault and, the critical theory. But, the public that provides its own discourse and provides its own conversations is taking care of itself. It's what gives us a community identity.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps those conversations kind of visible.
Right.
Right. And I think with design right now, there are so many different facets of design and labels that we give things. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a graphic designer, or you're an interaction designer, or user experience, or you're a theorist or a historian.
Yeah.
In some ways, we're all connected by that thread of design. And those are just, my own concerns going forward. But I'm kind of curious where things go. And, there remains to be seen.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I think this is so fascinating. It's I want to kind of turn it a little bit to ask you these kind of final two questions, because this next one's kind of very related. Is, what are the issues or topics that you think should be happening in this discourse? What are the things that are kind of facing designers or the design, profession, if you want to call it that, right mm-hmm. now, that need that kind of critical discourse around them?
One, I think, and I kind of just mentioned this, but the labels mm-hmm. that we give what we do, I think we actually need some more flexibility, or talking about flexibility, mm-hmm. or just what, I guess I even think, like, what is graphic design?
Yeah.
Which I know we could talk even another hour or so just on that. That's one thing. I think we need to talk about how research and practice mm-hmm. kind of come together as well. I think as much as we focus, and I say we very, very broadly, this is like in the classroom, I guess, my students and I, focusing on, design research methods that we use to inform our work. How does play factor into that? How does exploration factor into that? And mm-hmm. And this is something my students bring up, is how do you balance those things? Right. How do you take this evidence that you've got from, maybe it's an observation or an interview or something that you have evidence of, and how do you balance that with your gut instincts and your playfulness and your intuition and decision making as a designer? Is one more important than the other? How do those interplay? And I think it's good to be talking more about those mm-hmm. things. How do you keeping that playful aspect when you're also thinking about design research frameworks and strategies. And we have a lot of serious topics in the world, and that's obviously there are heavy topics in the world. Not everything is playful and fun. And so it might just be a sign of the times too.
Right.
Just how do you inject that playful, imaginative human layer into things?
Yeah. My last question, this is a question that I ask everybody, and you've mentioned your mentors and professors throughout this whole mm-hmm. Conversation, but I'm interested in, what are the books, or who are the writers or the critics or the theorists who have kind of influenced you, or, even if you were putting together a reading list for someone listening to mm-hmm. this that's interested in the things we're talking about, who's on that list, or what are the books on that list?
That would be a big list. As terms of, okay, I'll just start with some like creative work. So like work that people are doing. I would mention work being done by Garnet Hertz. Some of his work on disobedient electronics and critical making. and works by Jonathan Harris.
Oh, yeah.
Which, like Network Effect and some of his other interfaces.
Yeah.
So work like that. As far as things I've been reading lately, Library of the Printed Web.
Oh,
so
yeah.
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 I actually just read Alice Tremblow's Sifting the Trash.
Oh, yeah. I loved that.
Great as well. Yeah, very good. In terms of other sort of writing and practice-based things, Jeffrey Schnapp, of course, Ann Burdick, Joanna Drucker, Whitney Tredian is another like kind of practitioner.
I don't know that name.
You'll know it soon.
Okay.
And then let's see. I know that as I've worked on various projects and kind of thought about classes and coursework and stuff, I've dug into like Lev Manovich, Lawrence Lessig, Marshall McLuhan, John Cage. Fluxus, I think, is always interesting to kind of dig into. Electronic book review. So just anything on that site. It's great. Even though I mentioned before, Stephen McCarthy's The Designer As book.
Okay.
Also excellent in terms of like critical practices and stuff. So that's a bunch of things.
Yeah, that's great. That was a great.
Like, that kind of stuff. The book. I can always picture it more than I can like remember the title. I Read Where I Am.
That sounds familiar.
It's all short form, information culture, design culture, short essays. Inspired a lot of kind of what I think about.
That was great. That was such a good answer and really kind of well-rounded. Jessica, thank you so much for this conversation. This was so fun and really interesting to me. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
This episode was recorded on May 16th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.